Hello and welcome to episode 222 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with us soon is our esteemed co-host, Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3, and many other postings. Bill is currently doing a live news segment covering the loss of the submersible that was out there looking at the Titanic. So he will join us supposedly, hopefully, very, very soon. But if you're watching, you can clearly see that with us again this week, and we are always very happy to have him, is historian extraordinaire Jon Parshall. Jon, how are you this fine morning?
I am living my best life.
That is awesome. How's the weather up there right now?
Not so much. Yeah, weather advisories and yet more crummy campfire air coming down from Canada as a result of the wildfires. But we're hanging in. So delighted to be here.
It is hotter than fire down in the southeastern part of the United States right now. I can say that with 100% certainty. I assure you.
Yeah.
Miserable. But before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, as it helps others find our show. We want to get the history to the masses. And if you want to help us do that, hit that like and subscribe button, and like all the episodes that you watch, that will help the algorithm sort our stuff out and push it out to the people that haven't seen it. Back when, and it's the algorithm is a pain in the neck, but I don't even understand. I don't even want to try and understand how it works, but
they don't want you to understand how it works. Having fought the SEO wars as a marketing flack in the software industry for a number of years, they don't want you to know. So anyway.
Yeah, very true. So back when we did the episode on New Guinea, that one being Bunagona, which Jon was also a guest on for that specific episode, I made mention of forgotten fronts, forgotten theaters, forgotten battles, whatever you want to call them. And while people will always squawk about how their relative service is forgotten on so-and-so island all day long, there are really, at least in my opinion, truly, honest to God, forgotten fronts. Forgotten for many reasons. The fighting wasn't as severe as somewhere like Tarawa, or the terrain wasn't as foreboding as, say, New Guinea, or the war just simply moved on. And honestly, to those who were on those supposed forgotten fronts, they are most certainly not forgotten. Never were and never will be. Well, our topic today definitely lives under the classification of forgotten. A great many of the events that form the nucleus of this campaign occurred at the same time or close to other events that carried far greater weight when it came to the prosecution of the war in both the Pacific and Europe. Regardless, it was a portion of the Pacific War that was important for many reasons that we are about to discuss, was home to some of the most vicious and inhospitable locales on Earth, had some of the most unpredictable and hellacious weather on the planet, and still does, and yet still held a strategic, theoretically, and morale value, if only for a short while. The campaign we are referring to is known as the 1,000-Mile War, that being, of course, the Aleutians. Jon, it truly was a forgotten front. It really was.
And there are some good reasons for that. As I was sharing with you just before we got started here, I've actually been up to the Aleutians. I've been up to Dutch Harbor back in 2015, shooting a TV show having to do with Midway, actually, because the Aleutians are a component of that larger plan of campaign. And I can tell you, it's an interesting place. Dutch Harbor is a very interesting place, a gigantic labor camp for the fish industry now, and sort of has a kind of Mos Eisley spaceport vibe about it if you go there. So a very interesting location.
Yeah, I've never had the pleasure, and I'm not really sure, after having heard you describe it and seen images, that I'd necessarily want to have the pleasure.
Actually, I would like to go back. It was really quirky and interesting. And honestly, there's also a very good little World War II museum up there that talks about the things that we're about to talk about here for the next little bit.
Cool. Well, so why the Aleutians? If you look at a map, I mean, they are way up there. They're strung out like a string of pearls. Yeah. And they really don't. I mean, if you look at a map, they really don't have a whole heck of a lot of strategic value when you look at it in terms of the Pacific War yet. the Japanese and the Americans both deemed them to, at one point, to have very significant strategic value. So, the Japanese had set their sights in the Aleutians before they ever even attacked Pearl Harbor. That was one of the little, pinpricks that they wanted to make. But in your estimation, John, why was the Aleutians even a target for the Japanese?
Right. They looked at the islands, and if you were to draw sort of a great circle route of shipping from, say, the West Coast to points in Vladivostok, the shipping routes all go up around that neck of the world, and they looked at that island from an air power perspective as this is a series of bases that the Americans could use against us to potentially be doing bombing raids against the northern part of Japan. And so, from my reading, the Japanese looked at their campaign in the Aleutians as primarily a way to forestall any sort of American offensive activity that was aimed towards the whole islands.
And similarly, the United States had an eye on that area as well. Billy Mitchell actually called it one of the most strategic areas on Earth, which is highly, highly debatable.
Right.
But
yeah,
regardless, he carried a lot of sway in the pre-war world of the United States, and such as he did, the United States looked at it as a similarly strategic area prior to World War II.
Yeah.
The proximity of the Aleutians and Alaska to the mainland, to the continental 48, is what gave it its strategic value. And we'll get into that, why the shockwaves that the Japanese invasion sent through the American public later on when we get down to that discussion. Yeah. But you in our pre-recording notes, you had said something specifically about choices, shall we say?
Choices, right? Yeah, and were these good choices? One of the points that I made in Shattered Sword, broadly speaking, both sides are just absolutely, for want of a better word, smoking weed when it comes to thinking that the Aleutians are a strategic avenue for anything. As I said in the book, that the archipelago was useless for mounting any sort of an offensive activity larger than the occasional narwhal hunt. The driving factor here is the weather. The weather is just so god awful up here. The average island in the Aleutians has rain 250 days out of the year. And the other days, even if it's not raining, it's probably cloudy. Kiska, I believe, has only 6 sunny days the entire year. The average wind speed is 30 miles an hour all the time. There is often pea soup fog. The average temperature is about 40 degrees year round. They get these crazy things called willowaws. If you've ever been out to San Francisco and seen the mists rolling off the mountains around Sausalito and down into the bay, well, take that general effect up to a much colder locale, and you get these 100-mile-an-hour pea soup fogs rolling off of the cold air up in the mountains, coming down and hitting that humid air down at the ocean. And these things can last for days. So the flying conditions are unbelievably bad. And the ground conditions likewise. I mean, you describe the islands as a string of pearls. When you actually fly down them in an airplane, and I was a geo major in college, and so the first thing I noticed was like, this is really a string of stratovolcanoes. This is an incredibly tectonically active area of the world. So it's just this line of volcanoes, which means that the terrain isn't super great either. This is tundra over volcanic ash. There's very little vegetation. There's no trees. When I was shooting that TV show up in Dutch, we had the after shoot party at a bar called the Norwegian Rat, which again is just perfect for Dutch Harbor. And
sounds like my kind of joint.
Oh my God, this place! I'll tell you some stories. Anyway, out back they were having a little bonfire. Well, there's no wood in the Aleutians, and so the bonfire was shipping pallets that they had broken up and were burning out the back there. So, there's no building materials. There's no way to dig in. It's rocks and lichen and volcanic ash and miserable weather. That's the Aleutian Islands.
you're going to see as we go through, as John and I go through this, and Bill when he's able to join us, the weather is a huge factor in literally every single thing that happens for both sides.
Yeah.
And I'm talking in 1942 and 1943.
Yeah.
And now that I mentioned 1942, which of course is when the Japanese invade the Aleutians, there is, and I know you cover it in Shattered Sword, but let's talk about it here.
Yeah.
There is a conception that the Aleutians was a diversion from Midway.
Right.
Which I personally,
and brother, wrong. It ain't true. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That myth of the Aleutians being a diversion was a sort of a feature of the immediate post-war literature on the larger Midway campaign that came out right after the war. Because I to an extent, a lot of Americans looked at this operation like, well, what the hell were you thinking, guys, about going up here? Well, it must have been a diversion, to lure the American carriers out. This isn't true. If you look at the original Japanese battle plan, the Japanese intended to hit both Midway and Dutch Harbor on the same day with two separate carrier forces. And obviously, in order for a diversion to be a diversion, if you're really trying to lure the Americans out, you would have needed to have initiated your attack against the Aleutians several days before to give the Americans time to react, raise steam, and start moving. The reason that Nagumo ends up hitting Midway on the 4th of June and the Aleutians get attacked initially on the 3rd of June is because Nagumo could not provision his force back in Kure in time to actually meet his original sailing date. And so at these last session of war games on the 25th of May, Nagumo lets it be known to Yamamoto and the others that, sorry, we're not going to be able to make our sailing time tomorrow. We're going to have to push it a day. No one was happy about that, but that's what ended up happening, that Nagumo sailed a day late. So anyway, so much for the diversion myth. It's a myth.
Exactly. And I think that's what people need to understand too, because I guarantee you we're going to get comments on that. And it's like, there is no need to have a diversion when your main thrust is down south either. If you're wanting to do harm with Kido Butai, why are you going to try and draw people up with, a pittance of a force compared to what was actually coming to Midway? I mean, it's pretty.
Yeah, the whole Aleutians operation, frankly, got tacked on to the Midway battle plan. This was Naval General Headquarters political quid pro quo for having lost the debate over strategy to Yamamoto. They basically said, well, okay, you can do your Midway thing, but while you're doing that, you're also going to do the Aleutians at the same time, because the Americans are going to be busy elsewhere. Here's a good opportunity for us just to do this land grab while the Americans are fighting down south. So that's what's going on there.
So who's in command on the Japanese side in 1942? It's a gentleman named he's Vice Admiral Hosagaya Boshiro. Who was he? What kind of a cat was he?
Honestly, this is where your Japanese Navy expert is going to tell you, I don't know that much about this guy, and he does not go on to have a shining career, and maybe that says something. But he is nevertheless the gentleman that is in charge of Daini Kidobutai, number 2 Kidobutai, which is essentially built around Carrier Division 4. Carrier Division 4 is not the Rock Stars. This is the recently commissioned converted carrier Junyo, which was converted from an ocean liner, and then the older medium-sized carrier Ryujo. Junyo is one of my favorite carriers to kind of beat up on because she's a scow. I mean, her engines are notoriously unreliable. And this is the point of contention between me and Tony. Tully has this real weak spot for Junyo and her sister Hio, that they gave yeoman service through the war. And we are going to see them throughout the war. They fight all the way up into the Battle of Philippine Sea, and Junyo is actually going to survive the war. But from just a pure naval warship design standpoint, old, slow, cranky engines, not a super big air group. Ryujo, likewise, was one of those carriers that was built in the early 30s when people were still trying to figure out how is carrier warfare going to work. And so the Japanese were trying to cram a whole lot of aircraft into a tiny little displacement. By the time you get to World War II, her elevators are too small to operate dive bombers. So her air group is nothing but Zeros and Kates, whose wings can fold more compactly. So she's kind of a weirdo ship too. So yeah, Carrier Division 4 gets sent up to the Aleutians to do their thing. Their air groups are not super great, although, as I mentioned to you previously, they do have some cats like Abe Zenji, who's on Junyo. He is a very good dive bomber pilot. And some of the aviators who had been on Shokaku and Zuikaku during the Battle of Coral Sea, with both of those ships being out of commission, some of those aviators get sent to Carrier Division 4 on temporary duty. And so they're going to be up here in the Aleutians as well.
Yeah, Abe, he was of course one of the pilots that attacked Pearl Harbor. I think he was flying off Akagi during Pearl Harbor, right, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he was
and lived forever and wrote a great deal about the Pacific War. So yeah, an interesting guy.
Yeah, consummate gentleman too. I met him a couple times. He was an incredibly nice, very kind, soft-spoken individual, but true gentleman.
Yeah.
So the Japanese plan was initially to launch an airstrike from the carriers that you just talked about, Junyo and Ryujo, on the area of Dutch Harbor. Following the raid on Dutch Harbor, the Japanese were to then assault Adak, which we'll talk very briefly about Adak because really nothing really comes of Adak, which is over 400 miles away from Dutch Harbor. So this is, again, looking at a map, this is a big area we're talking about here that the locales are strung out all over the damn place. And it's not centrally located like Midway or Guadalcanal or places like that. So things are strung out. Additional landings on Kiska and then Attu, which we're going to talk about heavily here in a minute, would wrap the operation from the Japanese perspective. So to that end, the United States, we talk about the Japanese are sending, as you call it, the B team, if you will, to the Aleutians to launch this attack and then obviously invade and capture the area. The United States, it looked like on paper we had a lot of people in there, and we did, and the Alaskan frontier, as they called it, for over 45,000 men were stationed in that area.
Yeah.
However,
Alaska is a big area, right? Yeah,
exactly. That's my point, is that Alaska is huge. It's the biggest state in the Union. And the vast majority of the people that the United States counted in the Alaskan frontier were on Alaska. They were in Alaska, not in the Aleutians. Right. I got the numbers here. It's the majority of the U.S. strength lay, as I said, on the Alaskan mainland as opposed to the Aleutians. Main striking power for the United States in the area was the 11th Air Force that fielded 10 B-17s and 34 ancient B-18 Bolos, which these things are, they're older than sin, but yeah. I mean, these are old airplanes, weird looking airplanes that just don't see a whole lot of service. Hell, I don't think they saw much training service after 1942.
Oddly, we were using those things for anti-submarine patrol. I don't ask me why, but I was just looking up some of the RAF bases in places like Trinidad and Tobago. On the East Coast, they were using Bolos as anti-submarine planes because we just needed eyes in the sky, and it's an airframe that flies, so we'll use that.
But it does.
Yeah, from a credible air attack standpoint, no, these things are hot trash.
Yeah. The only real fighter contingent that we have in the area are P-40s, and there's about 95 of those, again, on the Alaskan mainland, not on the Aleutians. The American defensive plans, should they be attacked, which obviously they're going to be, lay in the theory that the aircraft of the 11th Air, and this is a major issue that we're going to talk about, the aircraft of the 11th Air Force that we just talked about would first find the enemy, locate the Japanese aircraft carriers, should they be there, and attack them, sink them, and leave the remaining surface fleet to be destroyed by the American fleet assigned as Task Force 8 under Rear Admiral Robert Theobald. Now, the problem with this plan is if you can get aircraft in the air to find said enemy. And
that's problem one.
That's a huge problem. And even if you can get the things in the air, Can they even see anything below the soup that is the consistent cloud cover over the Aleutian Islands?
Right.
So
not the world's most enlightened air attack plan. No.
I mean, it would work good if this was off, Florida, but
Right.
not very good when you have an area that is notorious for piss poor weather, and the people that are stationed there, the flyers that are stationed there, are going to tell you, dude, I can't fly 80% of the days that I'm supposed to.
Right.
So Theobald has a fairly substantial force here. He's got 5 heavy cruisers, 13 destroyers, 3 oilers, and 6 submarines under his command. Some of these submarines are fleet submarines. They are later replaced later on in the war by old S boats that are just older than anything else. But regardless of this, he has a fairly decent sized force up there. It matched nicely on paper with anything theoretically that Yamamoto could send to the area.
In theory, although
minus aircraft carriers, of course.
Right. Well, the other thing is that there is also an Aleutian support force that goes up there that is composed of Battleship Division 2. So the Japanese send Fuso, Yamashiro, Issei, and Hyuga up there. That is a quartet of 14-inch armed battle wagons. Now, these are old battle wagons, but if I want to pick my odds in a surface fight between Theobald and Bat Div 2, I'm betting on Bat Div 2. So anyway, for what that's worth.
Battleship's gonna
it's gonna clean their clocks. But as you say, the real problem here is that there's this Japanese carrier force. And even though this is the B team, the B team can beat up on a group of American heavy cruisers all day long.
Absolutely, especially when they're bereft of air cover, which they're more than likely going to be.
Yes.
So prior to the Japanese invasion, Nimitz and King were completely aware of Japanese intentions. And we've talked about the code breaking, and we don't need to necessarily get into that here. However, due to code breaking, the Americans were completely aware that the Japanese, at the very least, had the Aleutians in their target crosshairs.
Right. And I think that's a good way to describe it. We never have gotten the complete decryption of the Japanese battle plan for Midway and the Aleutians. And so it's important to clarify for folks that we're reading the tea leaves here. We're intercepting 10 to 15% of the radio traffic and then, putting together a larger picture. So yes, we knew that the Aleutians were in the crosshairs, but we did not know necessarily what was going to be sent up there to do the job.
Right. So to that end, Admiral King directed that additional forces, specifically B-17s and B-18s that we talked about, be moved westward so as to be able to interdict the Japanese fleet that was theoretically known to be coming towards that area. The Gray Book states, and I'm going to read this verbatim, quote, Alaska Sector, ADAC attached, recommends that not less than 54 torpedo planes or dive bombers supported by equal number of pursuit be made available Alaska in addition to present force. He also urges the Army in Alaska to move maximum possible bombers and pursuit from Kodiak and Anchorage westward, unquote. So
westward being the key thing. Move your stuff up to Dutch and to the airfields that are around that neck of the woods.
So King is moving, or he's instructing that people be moved to that area to defend against this threat. And this is a point I want to make, but he knows, because of the cryptanalysts and everything else, that the main threat in this time period is going to be directed against Midway. So they're sending people up there, but they're not throwing the kitchen sink at Alaska, or the Aleutians rather. It's almost as if they're almost conceding the fact that it's going to be taken, in my opinion.
I kind of think that's right. And I feel like I think that's an intelligent decision that we know how desperate the situation around Midway was in terms of scraping up adequate forces to put there. Nimitz simply didn't have a lot in the rucksack that he could reach back and say, I'm gonna send more up to you, Theobald. Theobald was screaming for more reinforcements and was operating also fairly cautiously as a result of the fact that he knew that the Japanese were going to have carriers and he didn't have sufficient air power. But from a risk management standpoint, it makes a lot more sense to focus on the one battle that is the important one that you think you may be able to win. Because the bottom line is, if the Japanese take a couple islands up in the Aleutians, okay, that stinks from a propaganda standpoint, but honestly, what are they going to do with them?
Yeah,
So,
and that was my point, or part of my point is that, because it was known that the area was crap for weather,
yeah,
crap to resupply, a horrible posting, which I know you want to talk about as we get through, as we get further into this. It was that's partially why I said that King was almost conceding the loss of some of these Aleutian islands, because he also figured, he had to have figured, how the hell are they going to keep these people in supply?
right,
This is a horrible, this is literally, the butthole of God's planet on the northern part of the Pacific Ocean. So how
right,
the hell are they going to keep, how are they
yeah,
going to keep them in supply? And more than likely, they're going to wind up withering on the vine in the end anyway.
right,
But as we'll see, things do change as the
yes,
force goes on here. So
yeah,
on June the 2nd, U.S. recon aircraft spotted the Japanese invasion fleet some 800 miles southwest of Dutch Harbor. The 11th Air Force was alerted and prepared to strike once the Japanese came closer. However, due to the area's notoriously fickle weather,
yeah,
the fleet was lost in the murk and not spotted again for the remainder of the day.
right. Yeah, and this kind of thing just happens over and over and over again. Aerial spotting from an airplane is just devilishly difficult to do, even in the best of weather. And uh, people have this sort of misnomer that oh well, spotting aircraft fly very very high, so you get the maximum amount of horizon or distance that you can, and that's not actually true. Most of the time, if you're doing spotting in a propeller plane, you're down at 1,500, maybe 2,000 feet, because what you want to be able to do is look out and use that straight edge of the horizon line as your mechanism for seeing things like masts and whatnot popping up. Well, it's pretty darn difficult to do that in a situation where the cloud cover is socked in down, in some cases right down to sea level, or 500 feet or something like that. Even if there are intermittent gaps in the cloud cover, you're not going to be able to do a good job of scouting here. And this thing happens over and over and over again. We catch a glimpse of an enemy formation, and then it disappears, as you say, into the soup, and you don't see it again for a day or a two or a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the soup that winds up screening the Japanese as they're coming in is obviously a hindrance to the Americans, because we can't find the damn people to attack them or do anything to them. But it's a help to the Japanese, because it allows them to launch a couple of days of consecutive strikes on Dutch Harbor, really without any kind of interference on the fleet itself. Now, there are fighters,
Yeah.
American fighters, that go up there and tangle with the Japanese, but the fleet itself is pretty much safe.
Is screened. Of course, they have their own problems in that, trying to launch strikes in this kind of weather is really, really difficult. And it makes it very difficult for them to then find Dutch Harbor and launch attacks against it. Again, we're operating in the days before Japanese radar. None of the aircraft are carrying radar. So, what ability do they really have? They're doing dead reckoning navigation in heavy winds, clawing their way through this cloud cover, trying to find this tiny little town out there called Dutch Harbor. The weather definitely cuts both ways.
I mean, you can imagine those Japanese pilots were cussing too.
Oh my God. Yeah. That's
They
really
were
hard.
not pleased. So over the period of 2 days, the Japanese, actually the first strike that they send in, doesn't really do anything. They're pretty much chased off by the American fighters. Yet the second day, when they come in, they do some significant damage to Dutch Harbor, the facilities around there. They light up a few of the oil tanks. They damage some of the wharves. They damage some of the buildings and the structures and the facilities around the harbor. So they actually do punch it in the mouth there on the second day.
Yeah. They hit a
And
ship too there and set it on fire. And I believe the wreck of that ship actually is still in one of the inlets up in Dutch, even to this day. They sort of towed it out of the way, and it eventually sank. I saw it when I was up there. So yeah, you're right. There was some damage done here during the course of that raid.
One interesting side note that you made that I frankly forgot about, one of the aircraft that goes, and this is huge for later on in the war, but it's nevertheless, it's important, and it happens here. One of the aircraft that goes down is an A6M piloted by a gentleman named Koga. This
Koga.
Zero. Yeah. Let's talk about that, John. This is huge later on.
It is. So Koga is coming in and doing some strafing runs over Dutch, and we don't have much in the way of modern anti-aircraft guns there, but there's a heck of a lot of 50 calibers that are being used in that role. And Koga gets hit, and it clips the oil line in his engine. And there's actually a famous photograph you can see of Koga Zero streaming oil out behind it. Well, he knows that he is going to, his engine is going to seize up at some point when he runs out of oil. And so they had set up an emergency landing site on an adjacent island called Akutan. And so the deal was, okay, if you get hit, bingo over to Akutan, set down there. We've got a submarine that we'll send in to pluck you off. So Koga goes over with 2 other Zeros with him and starts setting down onto what looks like a field. And what he doesn't realize is that this field is actually moss and lichen covering rocks. Mm-hmm. And one of the Zeros that's flying shotgun, at the last second sort of catches the glint of water. It's essentially a peat bog, a rock-laden peat bog. But it's too late. Koga's already got his wheels down. He sets down, and it's really rough. He hits some boulders, and the Zero cartwheels, head over heels, and he lands and snaps Koga's neck. He's dead instantly, and he's hanging there in the straps in the cockpit of this upside down Zero. Well, the 2 other guys are like, we don't know if he's alive or dead. We can't see anybody crawling out of the cockpit, but we don't want to strafe his plane and set him on fire, and if he's actually alive inside the cockpit. And so they leave. A month later, a PBY is just going to be doing routine patrols and happens to go over Akutan Island and looks down and like, holy crap, there's a Zero down there. Well, they send some people over and they recover this thing. They find the pilot, dead in the cockpit. The plane is in really pretty good shape. And so they load it on a ship and they take it back to the States. And within, very short order, they got it flying again. So this is the first example of the world-beating Zero fighter, which in the first, 6 months of this war has just garnered this outsized reputation as being, this Wunderweapon, that the Japanese have that can just fly rings around the Americans' fighters. Now we've actually got an example of this thing where we can take it apart and fly it and figure out what its strengths and weaknesses are. There's another myth that goes along with that, capturing the Zero was vitally important because it informed the design of the F-6F Hellcat, and that's what made, the F-6F such a Zero killer. That's nonsense. The F-6F had either already flown in prototype form or was shortly about to. Mm-hmm. But what it did do, again, is it allows you, if you've got this plane that you can fly around and check it out, it sort of validated what we were already starting to know, which was, this is a super maneuverable plane, but it can't deal with energy tactics, and it's not very heavily built. If you hit this thing, it is going to go up like right now.
Yep, and that's the main takeaway there is it informed American fighter tactics,
correct? Not
fighter development or fighter plane development, but fighter tactics. That's the huge thing. There's some footage that I have that I'm going to show in this video of that very Zero flying with American stars on it, which is kind of odd when you first see it.
Yeah.
But it's some of the only footage of not just Koga's, or as I call it, Koga Zero, because it is or was. It's some of the only footage that's like strictly of an A6M flying. You see it, and even Japanese news rooms just see them kind of zip by or whatever, or in formation. They're just doing formation flying, but this thing's doing aerobatics, and it really, really shows the maneuverability of the Zero, which again informed American fighter tactics, not development, but fighter tactics.
Yep. Anyway, back to the boom boom.
Yep. So Japanese landings on Kiska, they do invade, or they try to invade Kiska on June 6th and Attu on June 7th. When are they? Let me start over again. Japanese landings on Kiska on June 6th and Attu on June 7th go off as planned. They do invade, and they pretty much meet very little to no opposition on both islands. There are people there, but the people that are there either are A, Aleuts, the natives, or B, there's just very few whites that are there. A couple of American soldiers, and by a couple I mean literally just a handful.
Yeah, like a wedding
And
station's worth. Yeah.
yeah, and they kind of walk ashore and they pretty much do whatever they want to do, and they take those islands very, very quickly. However, there is one specific case. I believe it was so on Attu, 1,100 Japanese land faced a staunch American force of 45 natives and 2 Americans. And John, you had something to say about one of these Americans that was
Well,
captured here.
there's a pair of American missionaries up there, a couple in their 60s, and the Japanese immediately murder the man and then send his wife off to a POW camp on the mainland or in the home island. So once again, the Imperial Army and their just how they're lovely to everybody that they run into, and their need to murder a 60-year-old guy who obviously wasn't much of a threat to them, but this is how they roll. So
Yeah. On Kiska, and this is rather funny, but it's not, but it is. On Kiska was defended by a grand total of 12 Americans and 1 dog, and the dog's name was Explosion, which
yeah, yeah,
such as it is.
such as it
Most
is.
most of the Americans were taken prisoner and sent, as you were talking about just a minute ago, back to the home islands or some
Yeah.
other locales. The takeaway here, though, is the reaction of the American populace to the Aleutians, or part of the Aleutians, being
Yes.
captured. This sent thunder waves through the American citizenry, because according to what the American press was saying is that America's invaded, the United States is invaded, which,
Yeah.
whatever. But
Yeah, people absolutely freaked out at
yeah,
this,
they did.
and it leads to another extremely unfortunate episode. Sort of a smaller analog to the internment of Japanese citizens in California as a result of the invasion panic that was going on there in the early part of the war. The same thing happens up in the Aleutians, and the result is that all of the Aleut natives are pulled out of the islands lock, stock, and barrel, are sent to internment camps in mainland Alaska, places like Juneau, which in many cases are abandoned fish canneries with horrible sanitation and health conditions. It's a really dreadful episode. A really high percentage of the tribal elders end up dying as a result of things like typhoid and whatnot, which is really bad for just the fabric of tribal society as a result of that. So it's another not glorious page in American history in terms of dealing with minority populations that honestly didn't need to be moved in the face of that invasion. As I was saying here, when I was up there doing this TV show back in 2015, the producer had in mind that, I'm going to do some sort of a, kumbaya moment with some of the older Aleut natives who probably could remember this time and tell me about it, and well, yeah, there are some older Aleut natives that were around then, and they had no interest in singing kumbaya because this portion of the war was incredibly painful for them as a result of being uprooted. One of the things that ends up happening here too is, we're going to talk about back to this whole theme of a forgotten theater. There's thousands of Americans up in places like Dutch Harbor, and it becomes a backwater relatively quickly, but we're building serious fortifications in this neck of the woods. If you go up to the top of Mount Ballyhoo, which is the mountain right next to the airport is carved out of its flank. You go up to the top there are 360-degree concrete mounts for 155 millimeter howitzers. There are multi-level fire control bunkers up there. So we were really digging in anticipation of a serious Japanese invasion. Well, by mid 43, of course, it's pretty apparent that that's not going to happen. But now you've got thousands of American servicemen up in this god awful climate. There's nothing to do. They're bored a lot of the time. And so, what happens when you get a bunch of, bored young men? There's a
Mhm.
lot of alcohol abuse, there's a lot of gambling. Some of the more enterprising young ladies from the Alaskan mainland make their way up there as well. It's a mess. And what ends up happening when these native Aleuts come back home at the end of the war, they find out that their houses have all been ransacked by drunken American servicemen in the intervening few years. And that too leads to sort of
Mhm.
the sense of bad blood that persists to this day around, that portion of the war.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate episode that, again, I'm glad you brought it up because people, I guarantee you, people watching this, unless they live there or
Right.
are from there, had
Nobody
no
knows.
earthly clue. No,
Yeah.
nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
But back to the shakeup of the American population on the
Yeah.
continental 48. The fear was, and it was a legitimate fear. I mean, you got to remember this is June 1942. The Japanese steamroller is still trucking across the Pacific
Yeah.
Ocean, man.
They are 10 feet tall. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
I
The
get it.
fear was is that it would be a staging point for further advances down into the Alaskan mainland, which of course would eventually lead to attacks in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco. And I mean, which is
Yeah.
never
It's
going to happen.
never going to happen in retrospect, but at the time, yeah, people are losing their minds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a legitimate fear, even though it was completely irrational.
Right.
It was a legitimate fear. So
Yeah.
this leads to Admiral King having to react at some point. Admiral Nimitz is also fully aware after Midway now. So let's just call this July,
Right.
that something is going to have to be done at some point up there. It's going to have to be, if for no other reason but for publicity reasons. They need to kick the Japanese out of there. It is a thorn in the American side because if you look at submarine operations, let's say August 42 until the time we go back up in there, we're constantly sending submarines up in there. Howard Gilmore, he makes his first headlines up there in USS Growler, I believe. Yeah, it was Growler. He goes up there. He sinks a couple of Japanese destroyers off of Kiska. I mean, so it's a consistent deployment area for American submarines and vessels. And it's, as we've described, the weather is crap, and the supply situation is crap, but still, it is a thorn in the side that's going to have to eventually be pulled out
Yeah.
at some point.
And the same is true of the Japanese as well. They have a small but very busy squadron of warships up in this neck of the woods that are doing things like guarding convoys that are running supplies into places like Attu and Kiska. They too are building relatively sophisticated fortifications. If you go to Kiska today, which you can't, or it's really, really tough to, yeah, there are still Japanese bunkers there and tunnels and anti-aircraft revetments and the whole schmear. So they were bringing, pretty serious weaponry into those islands as well to try to reinforce them.
When they could.
Right.
And yeah, and that's the key, is that when they could. So, I remember when we did Midway, when you and I and Bill did Midway, one of the things you brought up, which was 100% true, is that if the Japanese were to capture Midway, which they probably couldn't have done it anyway, had they done it, it would have been a real pain in the neck to keep it in supply.
Yeah.
And this is really no different. And frankly, probably worse, honestly, because of the weather, because of the seas and everything else around it. So true to Admiral King's initial prophecy that, if they take this thing, how the hell are they going to keep it in supply? The Japanese do have significant difficulties keeping this thing in supply, as we're going to see.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward to 1943. By 43, the Aleutians had become, as you had said just a minute ago, a backwater theater for both the United States and Japan. Meager resources had been sent to the Aleutians by the Japanese, and the same could be said for the U.S. effort to disrupt Japanese intentions in the area, aside from submarine operations that I just mentioned, specifically USS Growler and USS Grunion, which was also up there, that had been sunk by Japanese. So it was a submarine hotbed, but that was about it until we started to actually make an effort to recapture the area.
Right. There is
Air
some
activity.
I was just going to
Go ahead.
say, there
Yeah.
is some air activity up here. In fact, one of the very first operational theaters for the new P-38 is up in the Aleutians, and it's a good bird as a fighter up here too, because again, it's got multiple engines, and so if you have a mechanical,
Yeah.
in the Aleutians, you've got a problem, baby. And so P-38 is a good plane from that standpoint, because even if I lose one engine, I can still get home on the other one.
And so there is a naval action that occurs here, and we're going to skip over this because Admiral Sam Cox is going to join us for an episode on Komondorski
Oh,
Islands.
you
But
the Komondorski's great. Yeah.
yeah, we're doing. He pegged us and said, hey, I'd like to do this one with y'all. And we're like, of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're going to do an episode about Komondorski with Admiral Cox here in another week or two. So we're going to skip over that for this particular episode and jump to April 1943. So the Allied situation in the Pacific, if you look at the grand scheme of things in April of 1943, we had things pretty much going our way. There were some tough fights in the Solomons area. Obviously, there's New Georgia that's coming up soon. There's Bougainville that's going to come up soon, and there's going to be, of course, later on in the Central Pacific, Tarawa in November. But at this point, we're starting to gain, we being the United States, starting to gain that momentum that is going to wind up bringing us all the way to Tokyo Bay. However, at this time, Admiral Nimitz realizes that if I'm going to recapture the Aleutians, now would be the time, because we have the forces, we got the time, and let's just get this done, and let's just get it done now. It's almost kind of like painting your house. You got to do it, but I don't want to do it, but let's just do it and get it over with. It's one of those kind of situations.
I think that's a beautiful analogy. Yeah.
It's true though. So to that end, the 7th Infantry Division, and this is the unit that's going to do the vast majority of the ground campaign here on Attu, which is where the lion's share of the fighting takes place. The 7th Infantry Division is an untested unit. These guys are training. They've been training in the desert, typical United States Army. And yes, I work for the United States Army, but I'm just going to say this is typical United States Army. These guys are training in the desert. And they're the unit that's grabbed and said, hey, you guys are going to the Aleutians.
To the Aleutians. It makes perfect sense. So
yeah, of course. It's like sending guys that are training in Mississippi to go fight, in New Guinea. So it's just it's not going to work.
It's brilliant. And yet, but this is the first fight of what is going to be one of the finest Army units in the Pacific. If you talk to John McManus, I mean, he just has nothing but good things to say about the 7th. They really are a quality unit. But this first experience with combat is going to be pretty hair-raising for them.
And it's pretty much that's par for the course, which we've seen so far in the Pacific War to this stage. That's par for the course. And this is nothing against the United States Army units that are fighting in the Pacific, but this is kind of the way it is. When they first get into combat, be they a regular Army unit or a National Guard unit, what have you, they kind of run into, a buzz saw of stuff, it just.
And the Japanese are not easy opponents. So
no. But, to your point, we talked about the training or lack thereof. To what you were saying before we started talking about this is that, where the hell are you going to train for the Aleutians?
I mean, you really would have had to have put this unit up in Alaska for months to get it acclimatized and ready to go here. And part of the problem that the 7th is going to have is, they've been training down in California, and they don't have the right gear. Again, this is a neck of the woods where, the average temperature is 40 degrees. Even in the summer, you're lucky if it gets up into the 60s. And it's going to be cold again at night. And Attu is not a friendly island. If you look at the pictures of it, it is pretty much snow covered all year round. And again, a very harsh, forbidding terrain. Not a lot of way that you can dig in here. It's a nasty place.
And you talk about equipment and uniforms and things like that. If you look at the United States Army, just the United States military period, with the exception of the U.S. Navy, if you look at their uniform distribution of this time, it was almost universally the same stuff that you see in 1945. It's, the wool tops, wool bottoms, and hotter climates, you can have HBTs and stuff like that, overcoats. But a lot of that stuff was not issued to your regular line grunts. They just want, like the big heavy overcoats that you see. Yeah, there are guys that have them, but by and large, they all don't. And even, if you're talking about in England at this time in 1943, a lot of those guys do not have that equipment. It just hadn't been
Issued yet.
distributed properly. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's just
No,
not that it's not
yeah.
there. It just hadn't been issued. And
Right.
like galoshes, things such as galoshes and shoe packs and things like that. There were guys, as we'll see, that suffered horribly from trench foot
Yes.
because the stuff just hadn't been distributed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for all that, the Germans constantly get sniped at, well, why didn't they have their cold weather clothing that first winter in the Russian front? Well, it's like, yeah, armies in general are big, unwieldy beasts and don't necessarily get the right gear to where it's needed. And the 7th Infantry is going to suffer here as a result of exactly that same phenomenon.
They're going to suffer horribly, frankly.
Yeah.
So the American naval force that is escorting, or that is supposed to escort the 7th ID to the Aleutians, was a powerful, if not old, force. Now, again, much like you were saying, the Japanese send their B team up here to the Aleutians. We kind of do the same thing here. We're not deploying USS Washington to escort these ships up here. We are sending battle wagons. We're sending specifically the Nevada and the Pennsylvania are going up there, as well as USS Idaho. So these are older pre-war battleships, 14-inch gun vessels that are, as I like to say, make 21 knots, maybe with a tailwind going downhill. So these things, are not fast ships, but they're battleships, so they do pack a wallop if necessary. Typical of the area, in the days before the American landings, Attu had been rocked by 100-knot winds, blinding snow one day, and clear weather the next. Because of this, the landings that would take place on Attu would be touch and go weather-wise and sea-wise, as we're going to see. You had mentioned something that Westerners had found Attu. What was the
Yeah, this was back, I forget, I think it's in the 1700s, the first Westerners ever sight this island. They commented that, yeah, it was beautiful weather, the one day that we actually were able to see the island, but we still got hailed on in the middle of it. So, beautiful weather up in the Aleutians is kind of it lies on a spectrum. Let's just put it that way. So, yeah.
Good point. So the landings, obviously the weather, as I just said, plays a huge part in this. It played, as I said in my notes, mischief with American plans, and that's putting it very mildly. D-Day was rescheduled 3 times because of the poor weather. The Americans are in the area, which also plays a part in what happens later. But the Americans are in the area, but they have to reschedule the landings no less than 3 times because of the weather, to get troops ashore. The seas were so high. I found this remarkable. I read this in Morrison here. The seas were so high that the battleships that I just mentioned, Idaho, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, had to elevate their main batteries barrels so that the waves crashing over their bows would not rip the blast bags off the 14-inch rifles. That's a battleship. Can you imagine those poor saps and the destroyers?
Yeah, it's just always bad up here. Yeah,
that is literally riding the vomit comet right there.
Yeah.
So on May 11th, submarines Narwhal and Nautilus. We've talked about these 2 boats before. Argonaut is another one. These are mine-laying submarines. These are huge transport submarines, which is what they become for really the remainder of the war, those that survive. They've been reconning the proposed landing beaches for 5 days. They sent scouts ashore on the northwestern side of Attu. Each sub sent about 100 guys ashore in rubber boats. Oddly enough, even though the weather is absolutely abysmal, these guys in these rubber boats make it ashore. To my knowledge, I couldn't find any notes of anybody being lost on any of these landings. And by lost, I mean being thrown overboard or rubber rafts being, destroyed.
Right.
These guys get ashore, and they get ashore pretty quickly, and they go about doing their business, which of course is to push inland and locate and do reconnaissance. Several hours later, after the initial landings, coaxed in by USS Pennsylvania's radar, USS Kane, which is a destroyer, put a further 400 men ashore to join these very scouts that I just mentioned, who, after climbing hand over rocky ledges, kind of reminiscent of New Guinea without the heat and the malaria here, camped for the night and awaited the main landing force, which would follow shortly thereafter. So it's already showing that it's not going to be an easy hitch, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and again, shades of Boonagona here. You know, the intel that they're getting is like, oh, this is going to be a walkover. We're going to be done here in a couple, 3 days. This operation shouldn't be bad at all. And once they get ashore, it's like, yeah, yeah, the weather is terrible. The terrain is terrible. It's snowing. It's really, really cold.
Yeah.
The only people that are probably somewhat at home here is that we are using some Aleutian scouts in this operation. So again, drawing analogs, you know, this is the Aleutian equivalent to 442, if you will.
Yep.
These are guys who have relatives who are probably interned back, you know, somewhere around Juneau, but they're here, you know, leading our invasion forces in and trying to get them ashore. So
Yeah, it's a fair amount of these guys too. I don't have the exact numbers of them, but these are it's a fair amount of Aleuts that are leading these patrols, and they're acting, to your point, John, they're acting as point guards. They're going out there, point guards. I'm not talking about basketball. They're acting as point. They're going out there and they're locating parts of the terrain that they recognize. Yeah, they're scouts is what they are. Colonel Frank Cullen of the 7th Infantry Division's 32nd Infantry Regiment his unit is sitting in LCVPs, Higgins boats. They're sitting offshore. They're being tossed around like corks in a bathtub in this horrible, horrible sea weather. And they're being told to wait, don't land, wait for the weather to clear. Cullen realizes pretty quick, this weather ain't gonna clear. And my guys are barfing in their helmets. And if we get ashore in the next couple of hours, these guys may be useful after, you know, sitting collecting themselves for a few hours. The hell with this. Let's go ashore now. And
that's the right decision, by the way. I'd just like to state.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%.
I'm remembering comments from a different landing with waterlogged seasick sailors, and one of them are soldiers, and one of them saying, I would have fought hell itself to get off this transport. Get me onto land. Get some ground under my boots, and we'll deal with it when we get there. So that's what they do.
And that's exactly what Cullen does. He lands with about 1,500 men, including these Alaskan scouts the Aleutian scouts that we just talked about. And they start to push inland. They actually do meet some resistance, Japanese resistance. The resistance is relatively light at this point. It gets heavier as they move in. But they're pushing past the Japanese OPs. How many, I do not know. I was unable to find the number, but it's relatively light resistance. The Americans landing here, Cullen's people, lose about a dozen or so guys in this fight, but they do push inland, and then they are starting to make their way inland, albeit slowly. On the southern end of Attu, men of the 17th Infantry Regiment and further men from the 32nd Infantry Regiment landed in thick fog, and by day's end, some 2,000 guys had been landed at the unfortunately named Massacre Bay.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah. And
it's got to make you feel good.
For the sake of our audience, we do need to put up a map here. It's kind of hard to envision this all, but there are multiple landings occurring in multiple spots. And the problem for the Americans at this point is, where are the Japanese? Because, even though there's been some occasional sniping and that sort of thing, we really haven't run into any sort of concentrated resistance, which is odd. So.
Mm-hmm. Pre-invasion bombardment, airstrikes, and that's another. We neglected to mention that along with the battleships and the cruisers and destroyers, there is an American escort carrier there called the USS Nassau. USS Nassau is providing the only real air cover for these forces at this point, as the invasion is moving forward. So, to what I was saying before, the Nassau's fighter planes, the F-4S that are strafing in this area, the shore bombardment doesn't turn up any Japanese at all. They get no return fire whatsoever. So
it's
the guy
eerie.
that's in the guy that's in charge of the Japanese here, the commanding officer, is a gentleman named Colonel Yamasaki Yasuo. He had been given command of this force several months previous. He had known that at some point the Americans were going to come, because of the fact that at one point, American radio traffic, we always talk about Americans intercepting Japanese radio messages and things like that, and further informing our plans and our operations. Well, the complete opposite of that happens here, is that the Americans are yakking, and the Japanese intercept this, and Admiral Koga informs his people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That there's something shaping up here and you need to be ready for it.
Mhm.
And it's intriguing here that Yasuyo decides that he is not going to want to defend on the waterline, which would have been sort of the doctrinaire solution at this point in the Pacific
Right.
War. The Japanese were very much about, throw them back at the waterline. But I think he realizes that his force is small enough that he's likely to be up against pretty powerful opposition. And so his best course of action is to stake out some point in the interior and let the Americans come at him in really bad terrain. And that's exactly what he does. He's staked out a couple of hills and he's up in the mountains, if you will, and basically waiting for the Americans to come at him.
To your point, he's only got 2,600 guys, plus or minus. So, I mean, the 2,600 guys are going to fight like lions, but it's only 2,600 guys.
Right.
And I mean, the Americans throw overwhelming numbers at these. And I say overwhelming. It's not like we're throwing, 25,000 guys up there, but
Yeah, we've got
we're
2+ regiments, though. I mean, he's heavily outnumbered.
right, right.
Yeah.
So he's under no false Yamasaki is under no false illusions that reinforcements are going to arrive. Now, he had been promised for weeks that the Japanese were going, the Navy, the Imperial Navy was going to send people up there. They were going to send more supplies up there because, again, they knew that we were coming at some point
Yeah.
in the very near future. But Yamasaki realizes pretty quick.
Yeah, I'm not getting this stuff. It's not going to happen. Right.
It
Gonna have to
ain't
fight
going to
for what I
happen.
get. Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and we'll get to it later on, actually, when we talk about some of the naval assets that the Japanese are pulling together. The Japanese are concerned about this, and they actually do eventually put together a fairly powerful fleet, to come up and do the thing. But that is later on
Yeah.
down the road. So.
Yeah, we'll get to that. So as American forces are trying to push inland, their ultimate goal was for each force to meet at a place called Chickagoff or
Yeah, right.
Chickagoff Bay.
There we go.
This would essentially, and again, we'll show a map here. Bill, by the way, for those waiting, I just got an update from Bill regarding the submersible that was lost in the Titanic. He's being held onto this news show right now, and he can't get off. So it looks like, unfortunately, Bill will not be able to join us today. So,
Okay.
Bill, we miss you. We'll see you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
it's the Americans are trying to meet at a place called Chickagoff Bay, and what they're thinking is this is going to happen is it's going to seal the Japanese off, and we'll show it in a map. It's going to push them up to this peninsula up here on part of the island and basically form a pocket. And
Yep.
the Americans are going to try and whittle this pocket down. And that's exactly what happens here. But it takes a hell of a long time. It takes a long time for us to make our way through there, so much so. And this is hindrance. The American movement is hindered by a lot of things. John, we talked about the weather. You talked about the rain.
Yeah. Yeah.
What happens when it rains, man? It makes mud, right?
It makes mud, exactly. And so, and again, the terrain here is mostly volcanic ash. Very, very little in the way of ground vegetation. And so, you've got erosion problems. It's just the terrain is really, really nasty. And the Japanese are up in these hills that are relatively tall. These are several thousand, several hundred feet. I haven't looked at the topo map, but when you see it in the picture, I mean, this is pretty serious relief. So it's just very, very difficult to even march, let alone put in any sort of lightning maneuvers that are going to unhinge the enemy's line. It's going to turn into a real headbutting.
And that's exactly what it does. And we talked about landing infantry here, which is one thing. That's a difficult process in and of itself, landing infantry in this water, in these seas, in this weather, the wind, what have you. Landing artillery is a significantly different operation than landing human beings. You got, several tons of steel that you're trying to manhandle off of a landing vessel in pitching seas. It's not going to happen. Right. So the artillery support for the Americans at this stage on Attu is only naval gunfire. That's not to say we didn't have our already onshore, because we did, but not a lot, not enough to support any kind of major offensive strike. So
Right.
we're using naval gunfire from destroyers Phelps and the battleships Pennsylvania, so much so that they begin to exhaust their magazines.
Mm.
We're trying to leapfrog through these ridges and lines that you were talking about, John, and they're proving to be a very tough nut to crack here.
Yeah. Well, and the
So
Japanese on the defensive are always a tough nut to crack. I mean, even though they are suffering terribly as a result of the climate as well, because these are not long prepared positions. I mean, Yamasaki only shoves them back up in the hills, just a few days before the invasion. But they've got enough time to at least, scrape out some entrenchments and that kind of thing. And the Japanese army is always absolutely obdurate on defense. You have to kill them in order to take their positions, because they're, in many cases, they're just not going to retreat.
and that is, par for the course here,
Yeah.
and par for the course for the rest of the Pacific War. But I mean, this is they're no different here than they are on, say, New Guinea.
Saipan,
It's the same kind of
any place
Saipan,
else.
wherever.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So the advance on Attu had been going, as we were just talking about, at a snail's pace. And while the Japanese defenses had been stronger than expected, not counting the OPs that they overran initially, the U.S. forces had more than enough men to overwhelm the enemy positions, or so it was thought. After 48 hours, U.S. forces had only advanced 4,000 yards from the beach.
Right.
That is,
Not
frankly,
much.
that's something you would expect on Iwo, but not expecting this on Attu. Admiral Kincaid, who is in charge of the overall operation here, was not pleased with the 7th Infantry Division's commanding general, Major General Albert Brown. He calls Albert Brown and says, "General Brown, what the hell is going on?"
Yeah.
Brown replied to Kincaid,
It's going to take me 6 months to take this place. That's like, yeah, not a good answer, General.
No.
Because among other things, the longer that this fight is drawn out, the more weather-related casualties we are going to get. I mean, the men are already suffering from trench foot and frostbite. We got to get this fight over with. And it's just, honestly, as much as I do badmouth commanders that don't understand the local terrain characteristics, this is an example where a fire needed to be lit under the commanding officer, and or he needed to be replaced. And that's exactly the second option is the one that Kincaid ends up taking at this point. They sack Brown.
Yeah, and when you tell your boss that, it's going to take me 6 months for an operation that's supposed to take, I believe the operation was set for 3 to 4 weeks. I could be wrong on that, but when you say 6 months,
no. Yeah, among
Not
other things, how are we going to keep you in supply for 6 months? We got to get this thing done.
Exactly.
Let's go.
Exactly. Get in and get the hell out of there. So he is, as you were saying, he was immediately relieved. I say immediately. Within 24 hours, he's relieved. Brown's like, he's gone. Yeah. Things go from bad to worse the following day on May 16th, when Colonel Cullen, we talked about him before, 32nd Infantry, were strafed by USS Nassau's fighters. Cullen had laid out, or he had his people lay out markers, for, the line, saying the front line is here, don't shoot past here. And the fighters go back there and they strafe American positions. Casualties that are inflicted are not heavy, but still, this is fratricide. This is friendly fire. This is absolutely inexcusable, frankly. And, this is something that we're going to see, frankly, all the way.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, it does. Close air support
is hard. Yeah,
it's hard. And go ahead.
If you don't have experienced pilots either, it can be extremely dangerous. And of course, friendly fire happens with artillery and mortars. I mean, this is just endemic. It just, I forget the statistics I read. I think it's as much as 10% of casualties in some operations is friendly fire, which is inexcusable, as you say, but yeah, it happens all the time. But from a morale standpoint, yeah, there is nothing worse for an infantryman than getting strafed by your own aircraft. It fuels unhappiness. It definitely deteriorates the jointness of your force command when your ground pounders feel like they're getting shot up by their own planes. That ain't cool.
No, not at all. And you're going to see this continually throughout the war. It does get better as late 44 into 45. But, even at Tarawa, which is a couple episodes we're going to do here in the very near future, there were Marines that were basically, they weren't basically saying, they said straight up, do not give us air support. We don't want it.
We don't want to be shot.
So we don't want to be killed by our own people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So to your point, John, it took Cullen's people a little while to get moving after that episode. They do start advancing again. And finally on May 17th.
It's Cullen that's put in charge of the division at this point. Is that right? Or when they sack Brown, I can't remember. Anyway, we have a new division.
I don't remember either.
And he does get a fire kind of lit under this force at this point. And we do start making progress relatively shortly after Brown is let go.
And they do link up. The two American forces do link up, and they form that pocket around Chickagoff Bay that we were talking about earlier. Because the Japanese are slowly pulling back, and the Japanese, to their credit, are fighting an incredibly tough withdrawal. They're not just getting up and moving back; they are fighting every inch of the way as they retreat back, or withdraw back is a proper term, frankly. Here, So. You just mentioned it just a minute ago. The Japanese had been kind of flipping and flopping as to whether or not they were going to send the combined fleet.
Yeah.
Not the B team, the A team, or what was left of it.
They've actually been pulling naval units out of places like Truk, moving them back to the home islands and assembling a fleet to go up there and rescue this beleaguered garrison. And this particular formation that they put together in the home islands is nothing to sneeze at. You've got 3 aircraft carriers, including the Shokaku. You've got 3 battleships, including Musashi, which is, one of the 2 biggest battleships in the world. You've got a couple of Congo and Harana as well, 14-inch jobs, bunch of modern heavy cruisers, et cetera, et cetera. From my standpoint, this is not a good matchup for the Americans. I do not want to be in Pennsylvania trying to fight off Musashi with her 18-inch guns. I mean, this could have been very, very bad news for the Americans. And obviously, too, the fact that the Japanese could have brought Shokaku, Junyo, and Hiyu, that's a very credible naval air force as well. So, the Japanese have the ability to potentially go up and really precipitate a naval engagement that could potentially have been favorable to them. But for whatever reason, and we don't really know, I don't have a good view on what those reasons were. They, as you say, they're flip-flopping and they don't decisively act. And the battle ends up being over before they can commit this force.
And that's what I was going to say is by the time they're like, okay, fine. All right, let's go. It's over. It's over. And we're not cutting short. We're going to get to the over part here in just a minute. But to your point, what you put in the notes, it's a real missed opportunity for the Japanese, because there's no doubt that if they go up there with that size force, with those vessels that you just talked about, they are going to wipe the seas clean of the old battleships. Tennessee and Nevada and Idaho. I mean, they're going to be sitting at the bottom.
NASA is not going to be able to fight Shokaku. I mean, that's just not happening. So, there was a problem here. I don't know what the status of some of the other main fleet units was at places like Pearl. I mean, conceivably, you could have hauled some other naval aviation forces out of Pearl Harbor and sent them up there, but I don't know where those carriers were at this point in time. So I really don't have a grasp of, from a counterfactual standpoint, did Nimitz have anything in his backpack that he could reach for in an emergency and send on up there? But this is not anything that you can react to quickly, because the Aleutians are, I forget the distance, is probably the better part of 2,000 nautical miles from Pearl Harbor up to Dutch. So it's a long way.
Very, very likely by the time the Americans would have gotten it, let's just say that Nimitz is like, oh my God. And he sends, Bunker Hill and Essex up there and Saratoga, say, which is already way to hell down in the South Pacific, so Sarah ain't come up. But let's just suffice to say that battle in the North Pacific is going to be over, man.
Yeah.
He's going to be hunting the Japanese and they're going to be ghosts.
Right.
So anyway, over the next 5 or 6 days, the 7th ID does make some progress, and they push the Japanese up into that area that we were talking about. One element of the Japanese defense area is a place that the Americans wound up naming Fish Hook Ridge. And again, and we'll show a map, you'll see it. It actually looks like a fish hook. And this is, we always talk about Medal of Honor recipients when we can. And this one, we're definitely going to talk about a gentleman named Joe Martinez. Martinez is one of the guys that is fighting in this fish hook area. He was born in Taos, New Mexico, and had been drafted into the United States Army in 1942. He took his basic training at Camp Roberts, California, was then assigned as an infantryman to K Company 3rd, 32nd Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry. In K Company, Martinez was a BAR man. And if you know anything about American infantry tactics in World War II, the BAR was the saw of the day.
Yeah.
On May 25th, elements of the 32nd Infantry Regiment were heavily engaged with Japanese defenders on Fish Hook Ridge. When K Company became pinned down by several well-placed Japanese machine guns, an initial assault in the area had gained some ground, but had left Martinez's K Company dangerously exposed. They were kind of hanging out there in the wind. They were exposed to not only enfilading Japanese machine gun fire, but theoretically a counterattack. If the Japanese wanted to push down, they could have just slid right into the side of K Company right there. So realizing that this is a problem, Martinez decides to act on his own. He gets up with his BAR with machine gun fire zipping all around him and his positions. And now Japanese mortars are dropping on K Company's positions. So it is thought that at this point, the Japanese realize, oh, hey, we have an entire American company pinned down here, and they are dangerously exposed. So let's lay it on them, which is what they're actually beginning to do here. Martinez decides to stand up and advance alone towards these Japanese machine gun positions that are pouring fire down into his people. And when I say his people, I'm talking about his platoon mates. He was not a squad leader of any sort. He's just a guy. He gets up. A guy of, this is a man. That's just suffice to say. As he's moving up towards the Japanese positions, he occasionally stops to fire and starts picking the Japanese off with his BAR. As he's doing this, his squad mates see that, oh, hey, look, Joe's making some ground here. They get up and they start to follow him up. This is not advancing across a parade field either. You were talking about the terrain, and this terrain that he's in, that Martinez is in, is no different than the terrain that they landed in. These are craggy ridges. These are literally, he's having to climb hand over hand with his BAR slung on his back. This is not an easy advance for this man at all. He gets up to the snow-covered hill to the Japanese positions, opens fire, and eliminates one machine gun with BAR fire and hand grenades. His success inspires the men behind him, who are slowly trailing him, to rush up to his position. Not finished, he continues upwards, taking fire from both sides from Japanese that are now in trenches. You were talking about hastily prepared positions. This is it. They're in trenches. Martinez wipes out these defenders in at least 2 trenches by himself with his BAR, finally reaching the pass above the Japanese machine guns. As he reaches the top of the hill, he encounters one last Japanese trench, opens fire, kills several of the occupants. Unfortunately, at least one of those occupants shoots Martinez in the head and kills him. The pass was eventually taken, and not surprisingly, Joe Martinez is awarded posthumously the Medal of Honor. He is the first Latino to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Not the last, but the first Latino to be awarded the Medal of Honor. That is a man. Yeah. You never get tired. I've said this 100 times already, but you never get tired of reciting stories like that or hearing stories like that, because that is just ultimate, incredible bravery and just balls of solid rock to be able to do that kind of stuff.
You really have to wonder, what goes through the heads at that point, making that decision. I'm just going to get out from behind my rock and charge these guys. But it's that sort of initiative that then allows mobility to be restored to this battlefield. You've pried open that whole defensive position, and now what could have been a real bad situation for your company now turns into an opportunity instead to unhinge a whole portion of that Japanese defensive line.
And that is exactly what happens.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens. Thanks to this one guy. That's, not to say that the company would have been wiped out, but they were starting to take casualties from this machine gun and mortar fire.
Right.
So if Martinez doesn't act when he does,
right. Who knows? Right.
Yeah. Who knows? So, John, we're starting to get towards the end here, and this is one of the more nasty episodes of the Pacific War, and we'll get to the details of this in just a second. But by May 29th, it was clear to Japanese Colonel Yamasaki that help was certainly not on the way, that they were not going to defeat this numerically superior American force. And, the Americans had, again, we talked about Fishhook Ridge. They pushed the Japanese back into this like little soup bowl area around Attu Village. These guys were going to die. They were absolutely going to die. And Yamasaki, he had like 800 guys of the initial 2,600. So, casualties hadn't been extraordinary, but when you only got 2,600 guys.
Right. And this is, to be honest, this is what I would call the culturally congruent method at this point in the war for a Japanese force that knows that it's going to perish to go out. And they select the classic banzai charge method for doing that. And it turns into one of the larger banzai charges in the entire war. And some pretty hair-raising results as a consequence.
So, you say banzai charge, and in most people's mind, it's a last resort. It's just the hell with it. Let's just go, and we're going to take out everybody we can, and we know we're all going to die. And that's exactly what was here. But Yamasaki was not some stooge. He wasn't some fool. He actually had a plan. His plan was to push through. Yeah, I mean, he's going to send a human wave assault, and that's exactly what it is. He's going to send a human wave assault at the weakest point in American lines. He's going to punch through those lines. He's going to try and get to the American supply depot that he can visually see.
Right.
He's going to get there, gather weapons, ammunition, whatever the hell he can grab, and keep on trucking. There is no stop here because he's not stupid. He knows that if they break through the lines, it's going to take the Americans by surprise, but it's also not going to take them very long to surround his people and wipe them out if they stop. So his plan is to push through, grab supplies, grab a hold of the American artillery. They're not going to drag it off, but they're going to destroy the American artillery that is shelling them, and then just keep hauling ass and go into the mountains and then play guerrilla warfare until everybody dies eventually. Right. And they're going to take out as many Americans as possible. So there is a legitimate plan to his charge here. Yeah.
And this, you make a very valid point, and that you see this over and over as well, that these are not spontaneous actions. They are always premeditated. It is some senior officer who makes the determination that, okay, this is the end. We are shortly going to lose our unit cohesion, and therefore we are going to put together this last charge in support of objective X. And so that's what we're seeing here as well.
Precisely. At around 0330, Yamasaki's attack smashed into the lines of B Company 32nd Infantry Regiment. They blew through these American positions, and I mean, just like blam.
Stampede, just like right through.
Exactly. And they're bayoneting everything in their sight. They're shooting everything in their sight. And this is a thinly held portion of the line. It's actually kind of like a hinge in a gate, and they just go right through that center part, and they just blast right through there. One section of the attack, unfortunately, needlessly slashed into an American field hospital. And this is one of the nastier episodes of the entire campaign.
Yep. And they're bayoneting patients in the beds and the whole schmear, because that, again, this is how the Imperial Army rolls. So
we talked about speed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, they just roll right through here. That's gonna understandably get the Americans' dander up as a result of that. But it's an ugly episode. And on a number of these occasions, here and in places like Saipan, when you've been engaged in combat for the last several days in this sort of grinding, in many cases, I can barely see the enemy because they're so well dug in. And then all of a sudden, the nature of the combat just completely flips around, and now I've got this human wave coming at me. It's really tough for the Americans to sort of shift mental gears into, okay, how do I deal with this?
Right.
And so, yeah, to your point, the Yamasaki's attack just blows through this initial portion of the line and makes it into, kind of the rear areas, field hospitals
Yeah.
and whatnot. So it's a real scramble fest here for the American defenders.
It is, and if you look at the map that we're going to show that I'll paste on the screen now, they move a pretty fair distance, and they reach the point of Engineer Hill, which if you see the starting point of the charge to where Engineer Hill is, it's a hell of a run. I mean, you're not talking 200 yards here. I mean, these guys are moving, and they are clearing a path as they go through. The engineers, it's called Engineer Hill for a reason. There were engineers up there. There were service troops up there. There's cooks up there. There's artillerymen up there. All of a sudden, these are rear echelon guys who are now staring eyeball to eyeball with hardcore Japanese infantry. And they go, oh my God.
Yeah. Grab your
Not what they
carbines,
expected to
grab
see.
anything you can. Yeah. And it's a fur ball. So,
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens here. The engineers and the service troops kind of tie in like a ring around the top of Engineer Hill, and they do stop the Japanese here. Typically,
artillery.
it does. Yeah, it does. It does indeed. And they start picking the Japanese off one by one, and exactly as Yamasaki had predicted, because they can't move any further, American infantry is now starting to surround them. They're starting to pick them off one by one even further. The Japanese do one final bayonet. I'm sorry, my fault. The engineers and the service troops do a final bayonet charge on what is left of the Japanese, which is, I mean, images of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain here at Little Round Top.
Right.
They do a bayonet charge and go down there and swoop and kill off what is left, in which Yamasaki himself is actually killed.
Right. And this is one of those episodes too, where you have to wonder if some of the analogous scenes that happened on Alligator Creek, where the Marines were trying to, in the aftermath of that battle, render aid to wounded Japanese, and then the Japanese were killing Marine medics and that kind of thing. And very quickly, the Marines had to make the mental shift to, oh, okay, actually, we just shoot and bayonet everybody, don't we? That's how this game is played. 7th Infantry Division here is having to do exactly the same thing because, the Japanese will murder you if given the chance, and so you can't give them that chance. You just have to shoot and bayonet everybody that's in front of you. It's ugly.
Unfortunately, yeah, it is. It's nasty, but that's the way the Pacific War is fought from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So
much.
After this charge is extinguished, by May 30th, it's essentially over. The fighting on Attu, there's mopping up here and there, but by and large, the fighting on Attu is over with. And this goes same thing for the Aleutians in general. It's pretty much dead.
Kiska is going to be evacuated before it's invaded, and it's a masterful withdrawal on the part of the Japanese. They are able to get that entire garrison off before the Americans are going to invade. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, the destruction of the Attu garrison represents the end of substantial fighting within the Aleutians Islands. But it's an ugly fight, so go through the butcher's bill here.
Yeah, so the American casualties for Attu are 3,289. 549 are killed. Yeah.
That's we put one infantry division into this fight, and rough napkin math says that roughly 20% of those guys end up casualties, if not more.
Mm-hmm. It's bloody. It is bloody, and it's something that most people don't think about when they think of the Pacific War. They're not thinking of the fighting on Attu, and they're certainly not thinking about it as a bloody ordeal, but that's exactly what it is. 549 are killed, 1,148 are wounded, 1,200, and this is a round number, are non-battle injuries, and this is illness and exposure. This is what you were talking about earlier, John. Trench foot, frostbite,
all that stuff. Yeah. And one of the things that I find amazing here, again, in terms of forgotten theater, the fighting here is absolutely savage. That if you look at the casualty ratio that the Americans inflict on the Japanese in the course of this battle, this is some of the most bitter fighting in the entire Pacific campaign. So typically, we would inflict casualties like in places like Tinian and some of the easier, quote, easier fights. You would see ratios of 4-1 in the Americans' favor. You get into some really nasty fights. You look at Saipan in particular, we were inflicting casualties on Saipan and Guam at 2.1 to 1, 1.8 to 1. Those were considered very, very difficult fights. Attu is 1.7 to 1. So statistically speaking, these were more difficult battles than both Saipan and Guam, at least from a casualty ratio standpoint. So this was bad stuff. Very, very bad stuff.
Of the plus or minus 29, to your point, of the 2,900-ish Japanese that were on Attu, only 28 were captured.
Right. And again, I could grind you the numbers on that, but that is above average. Typically, if we go into a Japanese island, 97% of the garrison would be casualties by the end, the overwhelming majority being killed in action. But here is an example of a 99% casualty ratio. So again, this is a very, very difficult fight and practically unknown.
Yep. And, the overall impact of the Aleutians campaign for the guys who were in it was obviously life-changing. For the guys of the 7th Infantry and the 28 Japanese that were captured, this is a life-changing operation. But as quickly as it enters the American and Japanese picture, it's gone. It's
gone. Yeah, absolutely. After this fight is wrapped up and we've essentially recaptured all of that American territory, and now this theater is going to be a backwater, and yet there are going to be garrison forces, Americans up here, in many cases for the remainder of the war, and not enjoying themselves, as we've already described. This was considered very bad duty to have to be stuck up in Dutch Harbor, manning one of these artillery batteries, waiting for an invasion that you and your buddies know is never going to come.
Right. Yeah. But it probably beats, walking ashore on any Weetalk or someplace like that.
Yeah, that may be true. Although to an extent, I think troops in many cases would prefer to be doing something active and useful as opposed to just being marooned in a backwater and having nothing to do except drink. So it was difficult duty for sure.
Well, John, do you have anything else you want to throw in before we wrap this sucker up?
I have blathered long enough.
Well, it's an interesting topic that is often overlooked, in favor of places like Tarawa and Bougainville and things like that. And we felt like it needed to be covered, and we hope that we informed our listeners and watchers as to why it needed to be covered. So,
and I do hope for your sake that you do have an opportunity someday to go up to Dutch Harbor and hang out at the Norwegian Rat, because it's a thing. So,
well, if for no other reason, I want to go so I can say that I've been to the Norwegian Rat.
There you go. Yeah.
So with that being said, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcasts. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this, or if you already aren't watching it, or any of our other episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel called Unauthorized History of the Pacific War Podcast. If you have a question, send us a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Paradin. I want to say thank you very much. And I'm going to also say thank you for Bill, even though he was not able to join us today. John, thank you for being here. And it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Good stuff. All right. We'll see you guys next week.